Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're exploring some of the most absurd situations police officers have stumbled upon, only to realize no one actually called them. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more incredible content. My coworker's story of how he found out he had a heart defect, I forget what it exactly was, jumps out to me. He used to ride his bike to work all the time at his old job. One day, just on his way to work, he drops on the side of the road. He was out for an hour or so before he came. He was pretty beat up, nothing major, but cuts and bruises everywhere. When he came, no one was around him, people driving by, people walking around. No one stopped to help, no one stopped to call an ambulance. He went to the doctor and got surgery done for an artificial heart valve. There was a quadruple murder in a residential area here in Sweden back in 1980, with several witnesses who heard and saw the incident. The attacker shot a girl by accident and then shot another guy in the following moments. The killer shot a total of 12 shots over the course of several hours. I stabbed 2 others to death with a kitchen knife. He finished everything off by dragging the girl outside, because he felt guilty for killing her, so that someone would find her and call paramedics. But he realized while dragging her that she was dead and nothing could be done, so he threw her down an elevator shaft. The whole ordeal lasted for 4 hours, and no one called the cops, even though 12 shots were fired and screams were heard. The killer was arrested 2 days later and killed 18 years later by the son of the first guy who got killed. I was responding to a disturbance call in a trailer park that turned out to be BS. As I was leaving, I noticed a giant puddle of blood on the ground near a different trailer. Upon further inspection, I realized that there was blood all over one of the doors, complete with smeared handprints and blood dripping off the doorknob. It looked like a fucking massacre. I started pounding on the door, and this junkie came out and started yelling at me for waking her up. I asked her if she was hurt, and she said she wasn't. She then proceeded to go apeshit about all the blood. She has no idea where it came from. I followed the ungodly amount of blood to a trailer about a block down where there is a giant party taking place. I ask the group of guys standing outside where the injured person is, and they all go G-code on me and say they don't know what I am talking about, while standing in the blood trail. I push past and continue down the road to Oz, where, at the end of it, I find a guy in what used to be an all-white outfit that is now dark red, attempting to control his massive head bleed on his own. I later discovered that he had been trying to break into that other trailer when he drunkenly cut his head on the window that he broke out. My father was a village policeman in the UK during the 1980s, so this is his story. Lady bought a house, and after many days or weeks of getting settled, she turned her attention to the garden. She started digging some flower beds, but as she was working, she came across some small bones in the dirt, baby-sized bones. This house used to belong to a doctor, so the lady puts 2 and 2 together and assumes he was a child murderer or maybe did some off-the-books abortions back in the day. This lady is shocked and terrified that her new home could be tainted by this horrible past, but she didn't call the police. Instead, she just avoids the garden completely. The whole thing weighs heavily on her mind as the years go by. 5, 10, 15 years, I forget how long exactly, but it was at least a decade, until one day she can't take it anymore and calls the police to report the bones. My dad goes out to investigate, into the garden, where she shows him roughly where they were. He digs around a little, this was the 80s, and apparently they were less concerned with disturbing evidence, and finds not a dead baby but a small plastic skeleton. A poor woman had been living with guilt and fear for decades because of a kid's toy. This was only a few years ago. I was driving along a suburban road one night, and a guy wearing only his underwear ran up to our cop car and threw a very large sofa cushion at us. As we slowed down to find out why he had thrown said cushion, he tried to jump into the back of the car. We got out and had a chat with the poor guy, who told us he had used about an 8-ball of poor quality cocaine and wanted to get attention to help him. Kicker was, he had been running around the suburban streets all drugged up for about 30 minutes, and no one thought it was odd enough to call us. To be fair, it wasn't the nicest area. A former Leo worked a late shift, was driving home, and decided to stop for some breakfast at Waffle House. I noticed a few people flagging me down as I pulled into the parking lot, which was shared by an auto repair shop. They pointed me to the back, so I pulled over and turned my spotlight on. On the back side of the repair shop, there was a dumpster, and there was a man lying down beside it behind the fence. I could see his feet. Then another homeless man walked out with a bowl and literally walked right by my car toward Waffle House. He was soaked, BTW. So I walk over to the man lying down, and he's unresponsive. I call in and EMTs arrive, and the guy is dead, I still to this day have no idea how or why. I have the homeless guy waiting for me next to Waffle House, and I ask him what happened, and he says, he was out cold, I was pouring water on him to keep him warm. Video from the auto shop shows a guy walking and collapsing next to the dumpster. He wasn't shot or anything, so who knows, heart attack, stroke, something, and for 45 minutes, this homeless man walked over to a water hose beside the Waffle House, filled a bowl up, and poured water on him because it was slightly cool outside and he didn't want him to get too cold. The water was cold faucet water, BTW. Literally nothing ever came close to the weirdness of that night in my entire career. I'm not a cop, but I think this fits. My partner and I were at our post, which was in the parking lot of a strip mall that had a bunch of stores and one bar, which was known to be pretty sketchy. My partner was taking a little nap, it was around 1 a.m., and I was watching a movie on my phone, waiting for a call. Eventually, I notice a few people coming out of the bar and just sort of lingering in the parking lot. A few more people come out, one lights up a cigarette, and they all just stand around. I go back to my movie, and 20 minutes later I notice there is now a much larger group lingering outside of the bar. Nothing strange was happening, but I thought it was weird that they'd all been there for so long, so I decided to check it out. I woke up my pissed off partner to have him pull our rig closer to the Ed group. As we approach with our lights on, the group notices us and starts to break apart. A few people scatter, and I see that in the middle of the group there is a person on the ground motionless. My partner and I jump out and ask what's going on. Somebody in the group goes, "This guy is wasted, he just stumbled out here and fell asleep on the ground." I shout to the man on the ground, and he doesn't respond. I check for a pulse, and there is none. I start CPR. While my partner gets our jump bag and notifies dispatch. For a full 30 minutes, people had just stood around looking at this dead guy on the ground, some smoking cigarettes, none doing anything about it. There wasn't even a noticeable commotion. Nobody asked if he needed help or called anybody, and they probably never would have. The guy was cool to the touch by the time we got to him, down for at least 30 minutes. We went through the motions, but there was no saving him. We transported him, and he was pronounced at the hospital within 15 minutes. How fucking hard is it to ask someone if they are okay? Or to dial 911? How was not one single person in that group not alarmed by seeing a man sleeping on the ground in a parking lot? I've had similar variations of this scene happen at least 3 times while on duty. People just don't give a fuck. Not Leo, but inspect or investigate issues in child or daycare centers. Staff members duct taped a 1-year-old toddler to a chair because they wouldn't sleep at nap time. One staff member witnessed the other staff do this to the child. 3 other staff saw the child taped to the chair. The owner saw it as well. No one said anything or reported it to the police. My office is civil, not criminal. I called the local jurisdiction and submitted all the documentation I had found. The parent picked up the child and couldn't figure out why the child's clothes had a sticky residue on them. Boy, was she surprised when she learned what happened to her baby? 3 weeks after I started, I was on my way to our off-site property control. I was just driving through a residential area to avoid the congestion and take a look at my new beat. I drive past a house with smoke pouring out from the eaves and 2 guys watching across the street. They pointed at me as I stopped and said, "I think there's a fire." That was an understatement. This entire house was filled with smoke, the windows were black with soot, and there was still no call. These 2 guys were just chatting away and not doing anything. I couldn't see fire, but it was July 10th and a sunny morning. There is no mistaking a house fire in broad daylight. So I call it in, try to gain access, and yell for any survivors. Keep in mind that I have 0 fire training but have half a brain enough to know that if there are any survivors in there, I won't be any help to them and will just be another body to yard out once fire does arrive. I get into the backyard by jumping over the hood of a minivan and sliding across like a Duke brother because there is so much junk everywhere. This takes a piece of the wooden fence and jams my radio key button open, so everyone can hear me breathing, yelling for survivors, etc. I have no idea I've got an open mic at this time. I lay down on the deck and look through the sliding glass door, and there was only about 4 inches up from the floor that I could see. I continue to yell for survivors but get no response. As soon as the fire gets there, they make a slow entry because the front door has been barricaded. This is when I knew something wasn't right. Suspicions were confirmed when firefighters yarded out 4 children, a mother and father. The father was the last one taken out and the only survivor. Everyone else, except an infant, had been murdered with a kitchen knife. Doing CPR on a child that you can see is obviously dead is something that will haunt me forever. I never thought I could take someone's life until I had to try and help a child who was murdered by his father. I've never wanted to choke the life out of someone more. Talking about it helps, but it still hurts. It's pretty common where I work. No one calls the police. Probably the most extreme was a shots fired call, extremely common, on a certain street that we really don't go down without backup. We drive through and don't see anything, then maybe 10 minutes later we get an anonymous call about a shootout inside a vacant house. We find the door wide open, covered in blood. We make an entry and find an absolute bloodbath. Blood, drugs, and casings everywhere. We recovered an AK pistol that had been fired. There was evidence that people had been dragged out. We only got one call about it, and no one showed up at a hospital later. Not in La anymore, but was for about 12 years in a large city. When I was a patrolman, I got a call about someone shooting off fireworks in a strip mall at 2 a.m. These were common calls, so we would usually just go check the area and clear the call. I checked the parking lot and didn't find anything, but I noticed the lights were on at one of the strip mall businesses. I won't say what business it was, but it was owned by a pretty prominent local businessman. Anyway, I got out to check and found the front door unlocked, which was suspicious. We had a lot of burglaries in that area, so I asked dispatch to call a rep for the business. I was clearing the building and found the owner and several other people, all really prominent, in a back room where a poker table was set up. One of the guys was sitting down and had a pile of coats in his lap, which was really weird, and he was acting like he was in pain. I saw blood droplets under his chair and asked him what was wrong. He broke down and moved the coats, then revealed he had a gunshot wound in his thigh. Long story short, these guys had a high-stakes poker game every week, and someone tried to rob it, and things went sideways. The dude robbing it shot this guy in the leg, which some citizens heard and called in a fireworks call. The guys involved in the game weren't going to call the cops and were arranging to have a doctor come treat him off the books. Gambling is illegal in the state I worked in, but we honestly wouldn't have given a shit. We actually caught the guy who did it, but the DA wouldn't prosecute because the victim or witnesses didn't want to testify or be involved. The victim recovered fine. One of the guys who I interviewed told me that they were robbed of over $30,000. So many. There's the usual, drive-by shootings, gang violence, etc., to the infuriating, child abuse and child exploitation matters. To be completely honest, the most absurd situation in which no one called the police was when my crazy neighbors across the street had their father-in-law have a heart attack on their front lawn during a barbecue. The guy's son was having the mother of all tantrums, shoving people, screaming, rolling on the ground, pulling up grass, literally breaking a window, all while shrieking at the top of his voice, "Please God, don't take my dad." The other relatives allowed this spectacle to unfold before their eyes while they formed a semicircle around this dude's seemingly lifeless corpse. I finally looked out my window, opened it, and shouted if anyone had called 911. I got around 20 blank stares. I called for them, and the crazy son tried to attack the paramedics while they were loading his dad into the ambulance. I called the cops for them too. Common sense really isn't all that common. I started my 4 to midnight shift by heading directly to get a coffee. Beautiful summer day, people everywhere. I pull into the parking space and see a dude lying on the ground in front of a park bench. I jumped out of my cruiser, grabbed my first aid bag, and called it in. The guy was conscious but not really responsive. It sounds like a movie, but we were doing the old blink if you can hear me deal. The rescuer finally arrived and took him to the hospital. I found out later on that the poor guy had suffered a severe grand mal seizure and was still postictal when I rolled up on him. The frustrating part was the dozens of people milling about that couldn't even bother themselves to call 911. Never mind, finding out that the guy was okay. I do mountain bike patrol in a smallish or medium-sized city. I was just riding one morning, just after rush hour, and I spotted a little kid, probably 3 to 4 years old, standing on the side of the road with no parents in sight. I stopped and asked him where his parents were, and he just kind of shrugged. I called it in, and some dude ran out of some townhomes across the street and said the little dude was standing out there for a few hours, and he was watching him to keep an eye on him. There were people around and everything, but we never got a call for it. Long story short, he wandered out of the room he and his mom were staying in nearby and wandered out to the street. The place was a shelter for women, and he was able to get out past the manager and a court police officer. Mom had died from a heroin overdose 3 days prior, and when the little guy got hungry, he got out of the room and wandered out to the street. No one even went to check on her, despite the smell. I am an EMT. We were waiting at a light right as we were headed back to the station for our end of shift. We see a man running like Usain Bolt across the crosswalk to beat the light, and a woman is chasing him. My partner and I both look at each other, and he says, "She's going to get hit." Sure enough, the car in the rightmost lane guns it as the light turns green, and the next thing we see is flip-flops flying and a pair of legs in the air. The female was plowed over and landed on her face in the street. We immediately turn on our lights and hop out of the ambulance. When we get to the girl, she's unconscious, pissed herself, and is bleeding from multiple lacerations on her limbs and a nasty head wound. My partner, who is a paramedic, starts his assessment as I go to grab a backboard and C-collar and call it into dispatch. She wakes up and immediately starts screaming about her boyfriend leaving her. She stands up and tries to run after him, face plants on the curb, and proceeds to lose a tooth. We finally calmed her down enough to get her onto the gurney. Mind you, she wouldn't listen and kept trying to walk around after suffering a couple head injuries. Once we get her into the back of the ambulance and out of the road into a nearby parking lot, the driver that hit her rolls up. By now, firefighters are on scene and asking what the hell is going on. We give them the lowdown, and my partner tells them we can handle it, so they leave, confused and somewhat trepidatious. We talk to this woman for a while insisting that she needs to go to the hospital, but she keeps saying that she can't go and that she needs to find her boyfriend. Meanwhile, the driver who hit her is apologizing to me and saying she wants to help any way she can. The woman keeps saying she can't go to the hospital. After we got her cleaned up and bandaged all the wounds, she asked if we could take her to her boyfriend's house. Well, as an EMT, I can do one of two things, either take you to the hospital or leave you where you are. She refuses transport vehemently, so my partner and I tell her that we can't take her anywhere. She then proceeds to hop out of the ambulance and ask the driver who just hit her if she would take her to her boyfriend's house if she didn't call the cops. Sure as shit before, we can even radio in that the patient was refusing transport to the hospital. She's rolling away in the car that just hit her and tossed her 8 feet in the air. It's not the craziest story, but one of the few that we just happened to be there for. This is my uncle's story from early 1990s Chicago. An elderly couple calls in what they said sounded like a gunshot from the apartment below them. My uncle and his partner arrive on the scene and enter the apartment, weapons drawn, standard protocol for a possible shooting in progress. Right in the entryway is, what's left, a middle-aged Italian gentleman who apparently made the decision to end his life by shooting himself in the head with a .45 revolver. He's obviously dead. According to my uncle, his face was basically blown in half. Nose missing, one eye gone, and the other hanging from what's left of the socket. My uncle's partner goes out to the squad car to radio for the cleanup crew, the guys that come and scoop up the dead guy. My uncle stands at the door, making sure no one enters the apartment until they arrive. About 5 minutes pass, and my uncle hears what sounds like something moving inside the apartment. He figures the guy probably has a cat or a dog, your pet will eat you if you die, and they are hungry, BTW, so he heads back in to shoo it away so it doesn't further damage the guy's body. He opens the door, and the motherfucker with his face blown in half is standing there. My uncle reached for his sidearm and nearly shot the guy, thinking he was a zombie or something. The guy just collapses again. Not like falling into a slump and sort of collapsing. Like fall straight back hits with a thud sort of collapsed. My uncle, after regaining his composure, radios his partner to call for EMS, and then he proceeds to check the guy's pulse. Nothing. When EMS arrived, they said there was no way the guy should have survived the initial shot and that they would have assumed he was dead too based on the amount of damage. My uncle says in his entire 20-year career, which included several shootouts and car chases, he never felt more scared than when he opened the door and saw that guy, who by all rights should have been dead, standing there. My apartment got broken into a few years ago. It was one of those off-campus college apartments. We called the police, who came at about 4:30 a.m. Our neighbors were playing loud music, which was pretty typical for them. When they arrive, they are taking the report. When the officer was talking, I was asking if our neighbors are always loud, and I told him it was only on Saturday and Thursdays and how it didn't really bother us, but before they left, they knocked and pounded until they finally answered. When they opened the door, there was a horse or a donkey in the living room, several studio cameras, and 3 or 4 people who were apparently filming a donkey show. I know those cops were probably expecting some weed, maybe a few minors drinking, but not a fucking donkey show. I remember not long after I started, 9 years ago, a woman came to the police department saying she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in 3 days. She told me where he lived, and once I got there was no answer. I was able to gain entry and notice the ripe smell of death. There was tweaker shit everywhere, stuff taken apart, random tools and motors, and all kinds of stuff tweakers work on. The house was near pitch black due to all the foil and blankets covering the windows. As I began to clear the house, I walked into one of the kitchen entries, and as I turned the corner, I looked into a big wall mirror and saw the reflection of her boyfriend hanging from a doorway. His body was a death gray, and his neck had stretched at least 8 inches. I remember having to pick him up and pull the belt out of the doorway. That image has stayed with me every day since. I am an ex-paramedic and used to work for our medical examiner's office. I apologize for not being a police specifically. After reading these posts, one particular instance comes to mind. While working for the Mayu, we were called for a badly decomposed decedent. She was in the bathroom of a housing facility. Her remains had leaked into the air ducts and flooring. EMS had been called because someone had slipped and fallen on her liquefaction in the hallway. I realized that a lot of these folks probably had bad run-ins with the police, but to let someone rot like that astounded me. You could smell it from outside the facility, and it took someone injuring themselves to have the authorities called. There is still a picture of me in a ghost suit on our local wall of shame because I ended up in the bathtub after almost adding myself to the injured while slipping across the bathroom. Real and current cop. I heard some screaming, saw some kicking around in a car, and blood was everywhere. I helped a lady give birth with an ambulance present. I saw a starving man collecting cigarette butts. I heard his story, I bought him food, and we shared stories. It was 1 a.m. and 20 degrees, and I took him to the hospital because his feet were numb. I saved him from frostbite and hypothermia. I saw a swerving SUV approach a ditch. A female got out and ran to the bridge. I tried to make a shitty noose, and I talked her out of killing herself. Some girl flags me down at a gas station and says her friend needs help in the hotel room. I follow and get rescue to stand by. A bare, naked girl is handcuffed to bed. They have no key. I keyed her while my embarrassed boyfriend watched. A car drove by without lights, rammed a gate to the water tower area, and a drunk teen was arrested. Later, he admitted wanting to poison the water reservoir to kill his ex-girlfriend. He would not have succeeded, since he had no poison. I saw fire under the car, pulled them over, rushed up and pulled everyone from the car, helped take kids out of the back, and they were dragging a mattress they ran over. I heard gunshots, went to the area, saw a shot kid, and saw frantic witnesses pointing. I drove to their points and saw a guy jogging. I commanded him to stop and placed him in handcuffs. I have hundreds more, literally. Edit for more stories I can think of that fit the op question. A frantic middle-aged lady with several kids in her car waved me down one morning when I was going home. She told me a bomb was put outside her garage. I had her wait somewhere and check out her place. I found a fire extinguisher with a Coke bottle duct taped to it. A closer inspection reveals a destroyed Coke bottle that was probably filled with dry ice. I suspected friends of her kids. I patrolled a neighborhood I never went through before, completely by random decision as I passed it, saw a flash of skin run across the roadway, chased a naked guy to a playground where he tried to hide in sand, confessed that he was a minister for some shitty small church. He was booked that night. I called the church in the morning. They seemed to not care. I posted about it on Facebook and linked the public records from the courthouse as proof. Local news had fun with it. Flagged down by a schizoaffective individual once. He claimed he had been abducted by aliens, had zero identity, but was in a panic, so rescue checked him out. He told them the same information that didn't register through the state's MVD or any of our reports. While he's in the van, another officer arrives with a fingerprint scanner. We find he is not in any database we have access to. Now we assume he just did drugs or something. He gave me his address to tell his family what hospital he would be at. Described the cars in the driveway. It's across town, so I hit it up hours later on my way home. The described cars are present. Knock on the door, people have no idea who he is. I described him and everything. Nope. I just left. I never saw him again, lol. I had to help the county with calls one night because they had a major incident that tied up all their people. I am not used to taking calls without addresses. There was one with directions like turn right at the barn, go past the rusted truck, etc. I follow the directions to contact a person about a simple theft that occurred at their work or something. I go to the wrong house and interrupt a barbecue. It was like 2 a.m. I stop at a skate park with problems to do my reports and be present so no one shoots each other. A kid gets shot anyway. I heard a soft, muffled pop. I was like, nah, that's not a gunshot. Moments later, kids rush to my car, pointing to the park. Find a non-skater type, jackass thug, inside one of the deep bowls. Blood smeared on some areas of the concrete. He couldn't get out because he shot himself in the leg while putting his gun in his pocket. He got a ticket for negligent use, $150. But he got another bill from the ambulance. $1,500. I would prefer the misdemeanor ticket myself. I heard screaming from a parking lot one night. I see a man and woman fighting. I observe for a moment and wait to intervene. The woman is definitely instigating and throwing all the blows. The male is backing away and telling her to stop, but she is yelling for help and for someone to call the cops. I arrested her for domestic violence. Guarantee, if people called the police for her, they would give me false testimony. Yeah, she was the one needing help, he was hurting her. I am glad I witnessed it myself. On my way to the jail, outside of the city, one night, I saw 3 pickup trucks on the side of the road. I drove closer and nearly choked in surprise. About 5 guys, 3 with rifles, stood on the side of the road, looking into a ravine. I could have sworn they were murdering someone. I honked my air horn from afar, ready to gas it out of there, since I have a prisoner who is my liability. The guys all dropped their guns and walked to the road. I get out, ready to draw down, but I feel like they're respecting me at this point. One guy approaches. As he does, I hear death cries coming from the ravine. He tells me one of their cows got loose, fell into the ravine, and broke its legs. It had been there for a few days before they found it. I nodded and blocked traffic while they put the poor girl down. I was called to a hotel to check on a room that was getting frequent guests not registered. The manager also did some Googling of the registered person's name. It was a 19-year-old college girl, pleasant looking, well-mannered on her Facebook page, nice looking family, had a back page listing for an escort service, was in college for biology, drove a brand new Tacoma. TRD mind you. The manager wants me to remove any other guests from her room. I knock on the door, she answers in a robe. I explain the manager's suspicion. She laughs and says she's from out of town, just visiting a friend, and he came over a few times to say hi. She allows me to take a quick look inside her room for guests. I come out of the bathroom and notice she closed the door and dropped the robe. She is completely naked and looks pretty good. She says, "Can you stay and chat a while?" Or something like that, I cannot remember exactly as this was 2013-14. I declined and left. I have really haunting, terrible scenes I have been to as well. Some of which were on national news. So it's not all fun and games. Bodies were cut up into pieces, people hung, heads were blown up with shotguns, there were lots of suicides, lots of murders, lots of car wrecks, and there was mayhem. Sadness has caused this cool guy some PTSD, mostly nightmares and the occasional sad day. But I live for the happy moments, the fun times in the job, and the people whose lives I actually save. The smiles and handshakes. There have been quite a few that are alive because of me. I know if it wasn't me, it would be another cop from my department. But still, it was me, and it makes me smile. My first year on the job, I was patrolling in a frat house neighborhood near a big Midwestern college. It was a Friday night on a football weekend, so we had our eyes peeled for any gatherings that looked potentially chaotic. Sure enough, we pulled onto one smaller block with a narrow street, where there were no less than 5 simultaneous keg stands happening right in the middle of the road. Several neighbors were looking out their windows with angry looks, but clearly none of them cared enough to get any of us on the horn. Good thing we stopped by, because several dumb kids were passed out and needed medical attention immediately. But wait, it gets better. Of the several intoxication arrests I made that night, one of them happened to be the daughter of one of my dad's best buddies. They had been roommates at that exact same college years before. That arrest, which wasn't her first one, caused her to get expelled from the college, and word somehow got back to my dad that I was the cop who had randomly stopped by and made the arrest. When I went to my parents' house for dinner the following week, my dad greeted me by beating me senseless with a pair of jumper cables. I was not a cop, I was the guy they walked up on. And I wasn't doing anything illegal or worthy of calling the cops, but I guess it was questionable enough to take a quick detour. So I'll start by saying I used to live in California, and Fresno was one of the places I lived. This had to be back in '06 or so. At the apartments I lived in, I never really had many issues, but I guess further in at the back of the complex in those buildings, some shady shit was going down. At least once a month, the police officer was hovering over this place, spotlighting the area, and I never really knew why until much later. I moved into a unit in their sister complex in '08 and got to talking with the head maintenance worker in charge of both places and got the beans spilled. Crazy meth head fucker doing weird psycho shit like selling the washer and dryer units provided in the apartment for money, straight crashing through his sliding glass door. Weird shit with him and the people he had there. The place was large enough, and I was clear on the other side of it. I had no fucking idea, but I guess some of the antics going on back there were SWAT team worthy. So, the last of those Star Wars prequels had come out on DVD somewhat recently. And for some reason, one of my buddies thought it would be cool and fun to choreograph lightsaber fights. Just because we were silly-ass nerds in our early 20s. I figured if we got some moves down, we'd spend some cash on some good prop lightsabers to spar with. But we basically used the Boken sticks he ordered up. Actually, come to think of it, Our first version was a couple dowels and a small, 5-inch long or so pipe at the bottom for the handle and counterweight. But those fuckers broke quick, and he found the Boken sticks online that were more durable and meant to hit each other for sparring and hold up. So usually we'd end up doing this shit just fucking about, hitting each other with these goddamn sticks like idiots and choreographing up these moves we'd follow. We happened to be doing this on police helicopter night, and they finally caught us fucking about with these sticks. The spotlight lands on us. We stop, look up, and give a little wave. The spotlight doesn't move. I look at my buddy, and he looks at me. I shrug. Fuck it, we're not doing anything illegal. We go back into it. A minute later, here come about 4 or 5 officers, all in tactical gear with assault rifles. They were holding them pretty casually, but I guess they got sent to see if we were just fucking about or if they happened to come across a fight during their call. They asked us what we were doing, and saying we were practicing lightsaber moves sounded pretty fucking dumb. So we told them we were practicing for a play. They pretty much dropped it at that. They asked me where a building number was and told us we should probably just go inside for the night. And off they went.